Dear Sony users, stop using back button autofocus. It was a good concept. It was a great concept during the DSLR days. When we switched to mirrorless, it became less useful because AF tracked very well. And we're gonna go over why you should stop using back button autofocus and instead use focus hold. So why do we use back button autofocus to start with? There's no need to switch to manual focus. You have one AF mode to rule them all, which is AFC, or continuous autofocus. You can easily focus to recompose, and you can also focus and not have to worry about the camera refocusing at the wrong spot. And this is especially relevant when you're using DSLRs because their systems aren't very intelligent. They won't track the subject. They track an area. Well, some of them do track subject, but it's just not as good as mirrorless. They track a general area, and the whole idea of the back button focus is that you want your autofocus to stay at that one location. When your subject moves left or right, which is along the focal plane, you don't have to move the focus points over left or right, and it's easier to focus and recompose. So that's the main benefit of having a back button autofocus. You don't really have to trip up the AF system, and you know that you've got good focus the first time and it will just stay there, and you want your autofocus to stay where you point it at. So the difference is when you're using DSLR, you kind of need to rely on focus points and focus areas. Where you're using real-time tracking or real-time AF, it's sort of the opposite. You don't want AF to let go. You want AF to stay and lock onto your subject. So it may have taken you a while to get used to back button autofocus. You press the button in the back, like it says, and with that, you start to focus with that back button, and it's decoupled from your shutter button. So your shutter button works independently from your autofocus button. And if you haven't used it before, it was a great thing at one time because you don't want your AF wandering and you want better control of that system. So it was a great thing at one time, but there are a lot of downsides to that. So if I'm gonna pass my camera to a stranger and ask them to take a photo of me and my family, I have to tell them about this back button autofocus, and it's not easy to explain to somebody that you need to press this button to autofocus and you need to press this button to take a photo. I'm not gonna say the word autofocus and shutter. That gets a normal user even more confused. So handing it off to someone that's not familiar with back button autofocus, it's going to be very difficult. It's not really ideal, and even if it was a family member, I'm just not really comfortable handing over my camera to them with it set up that way. In fact, when I hand over my camera, I make sure that the touchscreen is disabled, the autofocus is to area, and I'm using shutter button AF. Another downside that you will encounter is that many remotes rely on the button to activate autofocus. It may have either one button or many buttons. However, it does rely on the main shutter button as a focus mechanism. And if you're taking self-portraits, self-family group portraits, you lose that feature. So if you decide you have to move back a little bit or move forward a little bit to fill the frame better, and you press autofocus and shutter, it's not going to focus anymore. With the latest Bluetooth remote, it's less of an issue because you can actually focus via the camera, but it's still not perfect. I'd rather have that the camera just focus with one shutter button, and it's simply easier that way. And lastly would be the low angle shooting. So when you're shooting from, or just angle shooting in general, if you're shooting from down low and you're already pointing this thing, you have to do this all the time with both buttons, and it can get kind of tricky because you're at a low angle, you're pointing up, you're pressing that back button to focus while this button as a shutter. Just because of the angles, it may get odd at sometimes, And if you decide to put your camera on a boom pole, it's going to be way above your head. You can't press that button. And it's better if you have like a corded remote or the Bluetooth remote, which is amazing. It's simply amazing remote. So at different angles, you can tell that back button autofocus, it can get kind of odd because you're just constantly pressing it with your thumb and your index finger, and sometimes it's just harder to manipulate it when it's at a given angle. So it's better that you just only have just one button to do that, which is your shutter button. And so I know it must have taken us a long time, well, maybe a week, to figure out how back button autofocus works. Over the years, you just get really used to it and you don't want to switch back to anything else. That's all you want to do. It's just the first thing you do with your camera is when you get it, you set it up for back button autofocus. You don't even think twice. But I'm saying that if you're a Sony shooter, you really should consider your options. They built the camera sort of differently. They have focus hold. What is focus hold? It does what it sounds like you would think it does. It just pauses the focus. So this works. I mean, back button autofocus, the whole point is that you want to release your autofocus and you don't want it to work anymore. However, if you're using a smart camera that can detect the object and track, you kind of want to have autofocus as a priority, and in some scenarios you want to let go of the autofocus and not let it attach to your subject. That is where focus hold comes into play. So with focus hold, so instead of back button used to autofocus, you use a back button to release focus. So when you're pressing the shutter, you're using AF with shutter button AF, and you don't want to change that. So you use focus hold instead. Say there's a subject that blocks your view. You press focus hold, and then your AF deactivates. The subject goes through, and you let go, and you're in focus again. Well, actually, the focus hasn't moved. You've always been in focus the whole time. But you press the shutter button again, and the focus grabs again. You can get everything done that a back button autofocus person does. You have the same features. It's just the polarity is reversed, and that your autofocus is attached with your shutter button. Now you start to get the disadvantage reclaimed back where there were disadvantages before. You can hand off your camera. Somebody's going to press the autofocus shutter button. The shutter button, it's going to autofocus. It will autofocus and take the shutter, like how most people expect the camera to do. High angles, low angles, you press the button, it takes a shot. If you're taking landscape photos where you don't want any hand on, well, you set it to manual focus. I mean, if you're taking landscape, you sort of should be in manual focus. Or if you want to use the autofocus to grab the first frame, you can certainly do that, and then toggle AF, MF toggle. I have that set up as C3. When you're using a remote, the remote button will autofocus for you. If you don't want it to autofocus to you, again, you can hit C3, toggle manual autofocus. In general, I like to have autofocus because the Sony autofocus is very reliable. It hardly ever gets tripped up for those type of scenarios. You're doing a selfie with your family, you just arrived at Hollywood or something and you want to take the Hollywood sign. Again, it'll grab you. If you see it like this, you're holding it like this and you're going to take a photo of yourself and your family, there's no way I mean, you can press back button autofocus, but yeah, it's you're putting your hand into a precarious situation where you might drop your camera. But if you just do a simple hold and fire off, you're not going to have the same problems as somebody that's fumbling around looking for an additional button on top of that back button. So if you haven't tried focus hold yet, I would really start exploring it. It's a new feature that maybe you didn't have when you're shooting with Nikon or with Canon. I mean, it certainly is new to me. I've heard that the super telephoto lenses have them. However, I don't have any super telephoto lenses, and I mean, I would rather it work with any lens, and it does when you're with Sony. And reclaiming that autofocus button is really nice to have. You're just using it how normal people intuitively use their autofocus and shutter button. Remotes, they all work again. Handing it off to people, that all works again. Your camera is back to normal, and normal people can use it. And when you want the advanced features of letting go of focus, you still have that ability. So if you haven't tried it yet, I would suggest mapping focus hold to one of your buttons and just give it a go. I mean, moving to this mirrorless system, sometimes they give you new opportunities, new features, and you just have to make use of it. Explore with an open mind, and sometimes it really does help. And I find that focus hold is a great way of getting around the back button autofocus deficiencies. So if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.